Hi there, I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this BLR Book Talk celebrating the book, The Mind Electric by BLR author Pria Anand. Pria, welcome to BLR's Book Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. I'm so delighted to be here.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's just out from Washington Square Press. It's really just a fabulous book. But before we get into the book, I wonder if you could tell us about your grandfather and what you witnessed in the neurologist's office when your grandfather was a patient.
Yes, so my grandfather was really this larger than life sort of character in my childhood. He had all of these really, he was an adventurer, and he had all these really sort of epic stories of his life, sort of his rural childhood, of the adventures he had. He briefly came to the United States and studied filmmaking, which was a really sort of had this really remarkable journey aboard an American troop ship, bringing troops home after the war. And so he had always been this really larger than life figure in my life. And as he aged, he started to develop this sort of series of, at first, really subtle symptoms. He developed this really sort of insidious cough. He and my grandmother were, had been married for decades and decades at that point, and were so sort of entwined that they had all of these traditions, including that anytime they went to a restaurant, they would always order soup, and they would order 1 into 2, meaning that they would order one soup and share it 2 ways. And that was sort of the first thing that I noticed, is that he started to cough every time he had that soup. And I was at that time in my sort of just starting out in medical school, and I actually went with him to the neurologist and watched this neurologist examine him and examine his body, and saw he had fasciculations. He had these sort of quivering gasps of dying nerve fibers. And the neurologist examined him and did this really kind of exquisite, detailed, meticulous sort of examination of every inch of my grandfather's body. And at the end, he concluded that my grandfather had a post-polio syndrome, that he had polio as a child that had left him with a limp and one leg smaller than the other, and that he was starting to experience some recurrence of those symptoms as his body aged and as his nerves and muscles stopped being able to compensate for the injury. And I was just so, I was simultaneously sort of heartsick for my grandfather, this adventurer, this larger than life figure who was starting to dwindle away. And I was also just awestruck at the idea that you could lay your hands on someone's body and know something about their life story. This neurologist knew much, even though I had heard all the stories. This neurologist was able to divine from my grandfather's body the story of his rural childhood, and even sort of foretell the future, tell him a little bit about what the rest of his life might look like. And I was so awestruck. It really felt to me like a magic trick. And it's something that has stayed with me, and something that I think about every time that I examine a patient now as a neurologist years later.
Well, you were a fourth-year medical student then. And something else you were doing while you were a fourth-year medical student was submitting a story to Bellevue Literary Review. And we ended up publishing it in this issue, which is issue 25, A Mosaic of Voices, the issue devoted to writers exploring multiculturalism. And the story is called Commotio Cordis, which is fiction. And it was just a beautiful story that really took us out of our current time and place to a different world. A head injury is a big part of the story. But I'd like to ask you, how or when did you start writing?
So I think I actually sort of started writing before I ever knew I wanted to be a doctor. I loved books and stories as a child, and I actually thought for a long time that I wanted to be a journalist. I love sort of the process of interviewing someone, learning something about them, and then alchemizing that into something that could be a way of advocating for them, or a way of telling their story in sort of a beautiful way that might resonate more broadly. So I think I loved the process of interviewing people before I ever became a doctor, and started to use that in a different way.
When it comes to storytelling and writing in general, I think we writers we're always focused on the narrative, but we aren't the only ones. And early on in your book, you describe the world we live in as a deluge of sights, sounds, and sensations, which is just a fantastic way to describe it. But we wouldn't be able to function in this deluge. We couldn't make sense of it if our brain, or our left hemisphere, as you point out, wasn't doing something. And you describe it as applying a narrative to our experience of the world. a way to find coherence in the anarchy. So could you talk to us about the brain and its narratives?
Yes, so this is, I think, I think this is something that every single time that I meet someone who sort of struggles with a neurologic deficit, and any time that I kind of encounter a new neurologic illness, this strikes me every single time as a really remarkable feat of our brains. So this impulse for narrative is so deeply coded in our brains that when someone experiences something that causes them to lose an ability, the ability to see, the ability to remember, our brains immediately kick into overdrive and construct this narrative to explain away the information that they're missing. So our brains are really like so exquisitely honed to tell stories that even when they're missing something, that storytelling drive, it doesn't go away. And if anything, it becomes more active to help us make sense of a world that has suddenly become even more complicated or difficult to navigate. And that's true, that's true of brains that have been wounded in some way. And it's also true, I think, of healthy brains. I think we all are so sort of, we're so hungry for narrative. And I think that's, I think narrative is in some ways like the engine that drives a lot of the ways that we relate to others and relate to our world.
Did you think that's biological or evolutionary or cultural?
It's so universal that I feel like there must be something like physical and evolutionary about it. And it's so deeply conserved that you can lose many other things. So a great example is if someone has a neurologic disorder that causes amnesia and they lose both their memories of the recent past and their ability to form new memories. One of the things that often happens is that they'll develop this new sort of, I would call it a new kind of ability, which is to form a new narrative. One of the questions I love asking patients when I'm meeting them for the first time, when they're struggling with their memory, is, have we met before? And it is remarkable to hear the stories that brains can construct about how we might have met before, even if we're really meeting for the first time. So it's really so highly conserved and deeply seated and really universal. So there are reports sort of across many languages and many cultural traditions of this kind of narrative kicking in when our brains have lost something, that I think that there has to be a physical component. I do think that the specific narratives that we construct are very much sculpted and shaped by culture. So I think it's difficult to separate the two, but I think the drive to tell stories, I think, which is both a superpower and a liability, I would say. I think that is really kind of a physical, biological function.
So then let's talk about confabulation, which is different from lying, right? Confabulation is inventing things without intention to deceive. So you hinted that the brain confabulates, and I'm wondering how. You touched on a bit of why, but how does it confabulate?
Yes. So you're exactly right that confabulation is not lying. There's an honesty to confabulation, which is that someone is telling a story that, whether or not it's grounded in the external reality of their world, is true for them. And I love that confabulation contains within it the word fable, which, I feel like a fable is a story that has some essential truth, even though it's kind of made up of parts that are fantastical or that are sort of not drawn from reality. And I think confabulation has the same quality. And so confabulation describes this phenomenon often after a loss of memory, where someone will, their brain will, without their knowledge, without their awareness, will construct a story to fill in the gaps in sort of the information that they're missing. And some of the earliest reports of confabulation were in people who had, some of the sort of common examples are a type of dementia that's common in people who have a history of longstanding heavy alcohol use and vitamin deficiencies, or in people who suffered from some of the late complications of syphilis. And the stories that these people confabulated were really fantastical. So they reported that they were Peter the Great. They reported that they would sort of make sense of the hospital environment in different ways. So some would say that they were there because they were having a wedding. And every single day, this one person told the doctor the same story, that he was going to be having a wedding in this kind of hallway of columns and arches that kind of line the hospital. Someone else said that he was there for a trial and he was to be convicted and hung. So took in the world that they were experiencing and told a story to help it make sense and to fill in the information they were missing. So confabulation disorders of memory are sort of the most common, but we also have other forms of confabulation. For instance, when there's visual information that we're missing, we sometimes tell stories to explain away what we can't see. We sort of construct sounds to explain away things that we can't hear. So it happens with many different sort of types of neurologic losses, but really sort of as a way of taking in the information of the outside world, identifying this kind of missing piece, and then telling a story to fill in the gap. And again, is something that our brains do without our beyond our conscious control, without our ability to stop it, and even without our full awareness.
So we have this instinctive drive to fill in the blank, whether it's missing notes, words, sounds, memories, we fill it in.
Yes, right. I love that way of putting it, that it's an instinctive desire. And I think that's exactly what it is.
But in some ways, writers are confabulators, right? Even when we're writing nonfiction, we're constantly confabulating to create the interstitium to connect the facts. And so I'm wondering, how do you as a writer, a doctor writer, pull the experiences of your patients and your medical training, which are all factual things, into a coherent narrative, which is another way of asking of how did you pull this book together?
I really love that. I really love that framing. I think we often think about sort of neurologic symptoms as this binary, like either you're healthy or you have this symptom. And I think it's often much more complicated than that. I think confabulation is a great example where there's probably kind of a spectrum of storytelling, and we sort of draw a line as to when it becomes kind of a symptom or a problem versus when it's kind of healthy.
Or a delusion.
Or a delusion, right? Exactly. So I love that. I love that kind of that parallel. So the experience of writing this book was very kind of peculiar. Some of the pieces of this book I wrote when I was a resident. Some of them I wrote even earlier when I was a medical student, but I didn't start writing in earnest until I had my first child. And 6 weeks into being a new mother, I hadn't slept in 6 weeks plus 9 months, and I was sort of experiencing this kind of like sleepless, this sort of strange liminal space of the sleepless brain, and drawing all these parallels in my brain between the experiences of sleeplessness that I'd had as a resident and my experience of new motherhood. And so that was when I wrote a chapter of the book that was about sleep, that touches on the experience of medical residency and how strange it is to be caring for people who are kind of all in this vast gray area between awake and not awake, while also existing in a very kind of strange gray area. And so I wrote some of the chapters then, and then the book actually found a publishing home about 2 weeks before I gave birth to my second child. And the day that I came home from the hospital, I started writing again. And so the whole book wound up being kind of, all of the interstitium wound up being kind of woven in this like sleepless, manic, postpartum new motherhood's kind of haze.
Most of us just eat M&Ms at that time.
You did a lot of that too.
So we'd love to hear a bit from the book. I was wondering if you might read the section on inquietude, which is such a fabulous and evocative word.
I would love to. I first became pregnant at the height of the pandemic, when runners gasped behind their N95 masks and enough offices closed that even highway traffic slowed. At the time, my city seemed to be peopled mostly by flocks of wild turkeys. The turkeys wandered slowly from sidewalk to median, sheltering only occasionally under the awnings of boarded-up businesses in the rain, and otherwise perpetually driven to motion. They were ludicrous, reptilian heads and beady eyes bound incongruously to soft, fat bodies and tufts of decorative feathers. Rarely a car would pass and a tom would race after it, senselessly tracing his own reflection in the fender, as if it were an intruding male. Once I saw a hen trapped in the revolving front door of a downtown hospital where I work, spinning in slow, confused circles, hypnotized by the emergency room lights mirrored in the glass. In the void left by frightened, housebound humanity, wildlife everywhere seemed emboldened, freed from the pockets of forest and jungle to which it had previously been confined and impatient to wander. In Istanbul, pods of sleek silver dolphins reclaimed the waters of the Bosphorus as the traffic of ferries slowed. In Santiago, pumas emerged from the mountains to lazily pad the sidewalks, and in Lima, Flamingos swarmed empty beaches like so many pink locusts in a plague. In those months, the animals seemed to find their way into my body. At doctor's appointments, I learned that my son had grown to the size of a ladybug or a mouse, a quail egg or an ostrich egg. At my first ultrasound, the technician told me that the baby's heart was beginning to be forged, and I could imagine only a loose heart flapping wildly within my body like a trapped hummingbird, something entirely distinct from me that could take flight at any moment. But then I began to notice signs that my son and I were bound together, his existence marking my body with mounting evidence. There were my gums, which bled constantly. This, I learned, was from the extra blood coursing through my body, sticky and viscous, flowing into my son's swelling placenta. Despite the taste of iron contaminating all of my food, I was constantly tormented by a fathomless, savage hunger. At first, it alternated with devastating nausea, the two sometimes mingling in my confused abdomen until the thought of even the blandest food made me gag. When nausea cleared, I was left with ravenous. I craved grease and salt and the slick feeling of plasticky yellow cheese against my tongue. I had been vegetarian since childhood, but for the first time, I ordered a hamburger and chicken wings at a local burger chain, a notch above fast food. The cashier handed me 2 sets of disposable silverware, 2 packets of glossy red ketchup, assuming that I was ordering for 2. I found myself wondering as I ate whether that was the moment my son's heart was beginning to form. In my dreams, his heart was made of ground beef, his blood the great gleaming crimson of Heinz ketchup. Most of all, though, my body was marked by a new, torturous need to move that took hold when I lay down at night to sleep. The sensation of a rubber band coiling in each joint, tightly, tightly. The obstetrician calls it restless legs, but it was much more than that, a feeling I experienced in the most intimate of spaces, within my pelvis, between the vertebrae of my neck, nestling into the fine joints of my fingers. As a medical student, I had lived for a summer on a Caribbean island, Isla de Providencia. The island was the migration site of a rare species of crab, nicknamed the zombie crab. The name, I learned, is apt. That summer, they came ashore in hordes to mate, climbing the sand dunes at night like an army, drawn to the village lights as though they were moths circling the moon. In crab season, the air smelled like the sea, and I woke in the mornings to find crabs as big as dinner plates clinging to my blanket, claws raised before their insect eyes like boxing gloves. The crabs scrabbled against the tiles of my bathroom, tiptoed across the ceiling beams, reached out to me with beckoning toes. They were searching for ever higher ground on which to lay their eggs, and in their endless quest, they walked without ceasing until they dried up, fell, buckled beneath careless feet. The island became a graveyard of hard shells cracked against the concrete and brick-red bellies facing the dark sky. When the corpses finally washed away into the sea, all that remained was the faint smell of fat and rot, the only evidence that they'd ever been there at all. I thought of the crabs when my own legs became restless. Pregnant, I moved as ceaselessly as they had, wandering the apartment at night like a sleepwalker, bruising my shins against the low coffee table and toppling chairs. In the morning, the cockeyed furniture charted my path like X's on a treasure map.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Going back to confabulation, I think in some ways doctors are also supreme confabulators. And you wrote really a very telling line. You said, "Our morning rounds are an exercise in telling and retelling patient stories in a way that explains their illnesses, cloaked in a sense of objectivity offered by a white coat. But the stories told in these rounds are just as prone to false truths as the reports of an amnesia patient." And I thought, phew, I don't want to think of myself as a confabulator when I care for my patients, but when you frame it that way, it sure sounds damning. So I'm wondering, as a physician, how do you navigate this tension?
So I think it's really interesting. I think sort of as I kind of evolved through training, and I now it's interesting. I feel like I wanted to be a storyteller and a writer before I wanted to become a doctor. And when I was a resident, I found that storytelling part of myself was almost being satisfied by the experience of sort of morning rounds, and you're searching for a narrative. And I think what I'll say is, just like we use narrative to make sense of kind of the chaos and onslaught of our world, I think we need narrative in order to sort of reach conclusions. I think in order for every detail of a person's story to make sense, it has to sort of become part of the larger story of their illness or their symptoms. But I think we also owe it to our patients and to ourselves to realize that we are also telling stories, and sometimes we get the story wrong, or sometimes the details that the kind of the signposts of the plot that we seize on are not the correct ones, and realize that, you know, we're also trying to make sense of kind of a chaos of information with a story. So I think we owe it to ourselves to realize that there is a storytelling quality to how we kind of go about our work as well.
Well, how do our stories then kind of enmesh in this grand confabulation with our patients' stories?
That's a great question. I think when it works well, hopefully the two sort of align into a larger narrative that meets everyone's needs. You know, but I think we've all been in the experience, like had the experience where the story that the patient that we're caring for is telling is different than the story that we're telling about their illness, and those two can sort of be in conflict, and I think sometimes we need to rethink and unravel and be open to have some openness to a different story.
Absolutely true. And I'm wondering, can you tell us who have been your influences, both medically and literarily?
So that's a wonderful question. I think there's a longer list of names than we could possibly have time for here, but just a few. You know, so one is that I love the Bellevue Literary Review. You shared that I sent a story to you as a medical student, and I you know, I feel like that is a like, I think it just is a remarkable sort of testament to the role of narrative in medicine. And I think for anyone who either has experienced the medical system or just lives in a body, I think that there's just tremendous value to sort of to kind of the stories that you feature and uplift in the BLR. So that's a tremendous influence. Other sort of like kind of points of inspiration for me. So I obviously love the work of Oliver Sacks. I think you could probably tell reading this book that I so admire the kind of the humanity that he extends to his patients, and like the intimacy with which he's able to relay these stories. I loved reading the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle when I was growing up. I love the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, and I love the idea of a doctor as someone who solves a mystery, and the idea of kind of a diagnosis or a story kind of hinging on a specific detail. And that's still something that stays with me now as a practicing neurologist. Some of the sort of the early works that have really kind of stayed with me.
Well, it's interesting. You know, there are a lot of doctor writers out there, and many are quite serviceable. You know, they tell a good tale, but your writing is really beautiful. The prose is stunning, and I'm wondering if there are non-medical writers who you've either enjoyed reading or feel like that their writing style or craft has influenced you.
That's a lovely compliment. So thank you so much, and thank you again for reading. I read a lot of fiction. I love reading fiction. I love short stories, and sort of like thinking about how I think short stories often feel like, you know, I talked earlier about how the neurologic exam can feel like a magic trick. I think the right short story can also feel like a magic trick, the amount that you can achieve in sort of a small kind of compressed gem-like structure. So I absolutely love short stories. I think some of the writing that I was reading, what sort of had on my mind as I was writing this, I love Edward P. Jones. I grew up in and outside of DC, and he writes these really incredible, he has written a beautiful novel, but also wrote 2 collections of paired short stories about the stories of people leaving the South during the Great Migration and sort of going north and only making it as far as Washington, D.C., and sort of the relations between these people as they kind of set up a life in a new city. And I read that as I was writing this, and he does such a beautiful job of writing stories that are so inextricably bound to the sense of place. And I was thinking about that as I wrote, because I think the hospital really is a place as well. And it's a place that has its own kind of internal logic and its own rules. And so writing that kind of has a setting, and where kind of it matters which direction a crib turns down the street for the plot that's going to unfurl later, that really sort of stayed with me. So I read a lot of fiction, and I love especially short stories that remind me that it really matters where something takes place, because I think it matters a lot that these stories are unfurling within hospital walls.
I also think the idea of the Great Migration, I think a lot of it as a metaphor sometimes for people going from health to illness or illness to health. It's an incredible journey that takes you out of the place you were, brings you to a place, voluntarily or not, that's completely different. And you have to set up a new life in this new place that you have migrated to.
I love that metaphor. I think absolutely it's this incredible transformation. And it's also, like, I think illness, I think the sort of story of these migrations is also so relevant to illness, because I think it's something that you pass on to your descendants as well. So like it's something that ripples beyond your own experience to the experience of your family. And I think that like physical journey, I think can feel very similar in some ways.
And it's particularly potent, I think, in neurology because it may bring you to a new place of who you are as a person. You know, when you have congestive heart failure, you may still be the same person, the same sense of humor, same crotchety habits. But if you have certain neurological illnesses, it changes your fundamental personality for sometimes worse, sometimes better, but it brings your whole sense of being to a very new place.
Absolutely. I think it's such a challenge to sort of your identity and also to the way that the people who are close to you, your intimates, perceive you.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the hardest things for neurological illness is for the family and friends around them. Oof. Anyway, talking about the book. I mean, writing a book is just an enormous process. It often takes years, as you described. Have you found that writing this book has affected how you are as a doctor?
That's a wonderful question. That's a great question. You know, again, I wrote a lot of the book while I was physically on maternity leave and actually away from the hospital, and reflecting on all of these things that sort of crossed my mind in the years that preceded. Um, I I think I think I think I'll sort of what's really been interesting about writing this book is that I spent a lot of time sort of steeped in history and kind of grappling with how medicine used to view certain illnesses, or sort of the narratives that medicine used to tell about certain illnesses. And I think one way that it's really changed how I practice and think now is I think it's given me a fresh sense of humility. I sometimes think about, oh my gosh, the way that I'm reading these papers from the 1890s, someday someone is going to look back on what I did as a doctor and think, what were they thinking? And so I think it's been very helpful for perspective and to just remind us that there's so much about our bodies that we don't yet know and don't yet understand.
Yeah. And, you know, being in medical education, I think we think a lot about the difference between being smart and being wise. You know, all of our medical students, all of our residents and trainees, they're incredibly smart, and they're even smarter with AI and phones with databases on them. But I look at our job as educators is to help them convert these smarts into wisdom, which isn't an easy process because obviously we ourselves are still, you know, works in progress. But I wonder if we could think about that as you read another excerpt from the book. And I was hoping you'd read a section about death, or more specifically about brain death.
I would love to. Among the essential lessons of my residency was this: the Undine myth gets it all wrong. It's not just conscious and unconscious, breathing and not. Life and death are far from a binary. In the intensive care unit, families always told me that they wanted God to decide when their loved one should die. They never realized that God had already decided, and we, residents, physicians, hospitals, had overturned the decision. Death must have been so simple in the days when you could hold a mirror beneath someone's nose and see whether it fogged, when you could check a pulse and know that if someone's heart was beating, they were still alive. Now, machines can do the work of the heart and lungs indefinitely, but none can do the work of the brain. And so we have been forced to invent a new type of death to circumvent our innovations: brain death, a death in which someone's heart keeps beating, their lungs still billow and crumple with the help of a ventilator, but the functions of their brain have irrevocably ceased. Brain dead patients inhabit that endless expanse between life and death. To declare a person brain dead is to say that they have lost the most essential parts of their humanity, that they will never again wake, speak, or think, even though the rest of their body remains excruciatingly alive. On call, tasked with arbitrating life and death, the brain death pages were the ones that I dreaded the most. Testing for brain death is methodical. It requires interrogating each of the functions of the cortex and brainstem in turn, A cotton swab dragged lightly across each cornea to test for a reflexive wince, a light shown in each pupil to see if it shrinks. The final step required to make a diagnosis of brain death is the apnea test, in which a person is taken off artificial respiration to see whether they breathe on their own. The room is always full during an apnea test, packed with doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists, but the neurologist who taught me the brain death exam told me not to get distracted. Everyone else is watching the machines, he said. Your job is to watch the chest. Watching the chest means watching to see whether someone's chest rises as their blood fills with carbon dioxide, to see whether their drive to breathe, buried in the deepest parts of the brainstem, can overcome their injury. In neurology, even that which is common sometimes seems miraculous, the truths of our bodies and minds as strange as any fiction. I have seen a brain-dead person rise from his bed, arms clasped at his chest as though in prayer, the Lazarus effect, named for the biblical man who lay dead 4 days before he was resurrected. The Lazarus effect is the product of something mundane, the drive to move stored in the spinal cord and untethered by the stress of oxygen loss, even when the functions of the brain have entirely stopped. Still, as a medical student, to see a man seeming to rise from the dead would have filled me with wonder at the divinity of bodies, would have felt consecrated. As an exhausted resident, I saw it only as more death. The minute it took for the rigid body to fall still again, delaying me from examining the next patient, from writing the notes that would otherwise keep me in the hospital until late the following afternoon, from desperately closing my eyes on the call room bed, pleading silently for just 5 minutes of rest. As I continued residency, death became ordinary. It no longer broke my heart. In the final days of my training, I cared for a young woman who died of a massive hemorrhage hours after she arrived at the hospital. By then, I could do the brain death examination by rote, swinging my penlight at each pupil with a flick of the hand while the other carefully lifted each eyelid. When I told the woman's family that she was brain dead, her twin sister howled a guttural noise that seemed to come from some yawning chasm deeper than her throat. Their father knelt beside her, but she pushed him away. You still have your sister, she sobbed. Your sister is alive and mine is gone. Once I would have thought of my own sister and felt the same chasm open in my own chest. But instead, I murmured an apology, thinking only of the paperwork of death, something else that had to be done before I could sleep. To become a doctor, I was becoming less of a human being.
So, so looking back at that time in training and the doctor that you are today, were there any key moments or influences or people that helped you transition that smartness into inklings of wisdom?
That's still very much a work in progress. And it's interesting. I think now, actually, it's interesting that I feel like now having students and residents feels really essential to sort of to remembering. I think there are a lot of things that having students and residents helps me with. So remembering that, I think when you have been in practice, as the longer that you're in practice, the more likely it is that you've seen something before. And I think having someone who has fresh eyes, who's seeing things for the first time, can give me of a sense of sort of awe or wonder or heartbreak, all of these things that I think it can be really easy to lose. So I will say that I think having residents and students now is very helpful for keeping a sense of the bigger picture. I think during my training, there were many faculty and residents who made me better and helped to transform me into a doctor. I think sort of what has stayed with me the most kind of potently are particular patients and patients I cared for and sort of their stories. And I think that has been I think some of those kind of memories stay with me even more potently and guide my practice now even more potently than sort of my explicit teachers when I was in training.
Now, you've specialized to some degree in neuroimmunology. And I'm wondering if you could tell us very briefly what that is, but then talk to us about the narratives of neuroimmunology and how those stories play out.
Yes. So I did some sort of subspecialty training in neuroimmunology and a very close relative of neuroimmunology, which is neuroinfectious diseases. So when someone has an infection of their body, how that affects their brain and the nervous system. Neuroimmunology kind of describes this intersection between the immune system and the nervous system. And the immune system is this really ancient, evolved army that's designed to protect our body kind of as a battleground against foreign invaders, meaning viruses, bacteria, all of the things that can invade our bodies and cause unpleasant symptoms. And neuroimmunology deals with what happens when that army kind of goes rogue and fails to recognize kind of when there's friendly fire from that army, I would say. And so, so I think there are a couple of things that are really unique about neuroimmunology, which is one is that I think it's often sort of a disease of, often describes diseases of young women. And it's still a little bit mysterious why that is, why young women are more prone to autoimmune diseases or to diseases caused by their own immune system. But by contrast, I think a lot of neurology, where often patients we care for are older. Neuroimmunology, we often care for young women. And I think the other thing that is really difficult about kind of this set of diseases is that for a lot of the history of neurology, we dealt with many diseases where the best that we could do would be to give someone a diagnosis and give them sort of a crystal ball as to what their life might look like with this diagnosis, but we didn't have treatments to offer. And I think in neuroimmunology, that's a little bit different. It's rapidly evolving, but there are many, many things we can offer if we get the story right. And it becomes even more important, I think, to sort of hear clues from our patients to get the story right. And I think neuroinfectious diseases is similarly a field that is really bound up in story. So to make a diagnosis in the world of neuroinfectious diseases means hearing your patient's story, the story of where they came from, their migration journey, all of the things that happened before they ever went up in your clinic. And you really need all those details in order to kind of get the answer right.
Years ago, I attended a lecture that Abraham Verghese gave at the American College of Physicians entitled something like What Doctors Can Learn from Novelists. And the idea, particularly for people in fields like neurology or internal medicine who are making a diagnosis, you don't have a lot of tools other than the story, and that you're looking for details in the same way that a novelist is trying to paint this picture, of a character with their voice, the tone, the way they move, all these fine details that you might ordinarily just use an adverb for, quickly, happily, sadly, but we have to get those fine-tuning details. And sounds like you really do that with neuroimmunology and infectious neurology.
Yes, I had the absolute incredible honor of being a medical student with Abraham Verghese at Stanford. And I can say on good authority that he brings the exact same attention to detail to his patients as he does to his novels. I will never forget the experience of being on rounds with him and watching him pause in the doorway of a patient's room to comment on the smell. The smell was the smell of Fetter hepaticus, the smell of a failing liver. And he just was so attentive to those details that I think it is unsurprising that he's as incredible of a novelist as he is.
Absolutely. So what's next for you? What any interesting ideas percolating in your limbic system?
So the experience of writing this book was both kind of long and also really pleasurable. And I would really love to be given the chance to write more. And I think all of the things that I write in the future will also still be at the intersection of sort of narrative, culture, illness, our storytelling brains. I would love to write this book felt very wide ranging, and I would love to write about something that has a little bit of a tighter story, but still kind of delves into the history of medicine and neurology in a way that reminds me of the humility that we should all have as we practice medicine now.
Well, thank you, Pria Anand. Her debut book is The Mind Electric. It's available in bookstores everywhere. Get your copy also of BLR issue 25 at blreview.org, and to read Priya's fantastic fiction story and so many other stories, poems, and essays. Thank you, Pria, for joining us, and thank you so much to the audience for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for having me. It's such a pleasure to see you, and thank you for giving me a chance so many years ago to kind of be a part of this amazing, amazing platform you've built.
How lucky we were.